Hey guys, welcome back. Glad you joined us for the podcast today as we begin a brand new series. Can't wait to tell you all about it, so listen in.
Welcome to Everyday Truth with Kurt Skelly. We believe the Bible is true and relevant to everyone, everywhere, every day. If today's conversation is a help to you, take a moment to leave a review or share it with a friend. Thanks for listening. Now, let's join Kurt for today's episode.
Hey friends, welcome back to another episode of Everyday Truth and a brand new episode as we begin a new book of the Bible. In fact, books of the Bible, because we're starting a study today entitled The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly. Think about that. I think there was a Clint Eastwood movie with that name. But the reason why we've chosen that title is because the books of 1st and 2nd Kings really cover just the good, the bad, and the ugly. It covers a time of kings, hence the name, Kings, 1st and 2nd Kings, from the time of David all the way to the Babylonian captivity. And I think most of you know that means that there were kings that followed David, like David, Solomon, but then the kingdom split. So what we find is a succession of kings in the northern kingdom. There were 19 of them. They were all bad. Every single one of them was bad. And then that kingdom ended in 722 BC. So we have that line, and then we have a line of kings from the southern kingdom. Remember, Solomon, it's split, so we have a northern kingdom. The southern kingdom, these are the children of David. So Solomon's son, Rehoboam, the grandson of David, all the way to the Babylonian captivity. In fact, the book 2 Kings ends with one of Josiah's sons who had been taken into Babylonian captivity, was in Babylon, was imprisoned for 35 years, and then was released. And why is that important? That's important because the books of 1st and 2nd Kings were written, some people attribute them to Jeremiah, actually. We don't know, or a series of historians. But whoever the final compiler was, and it may have been Jeremiah, whoever that was, recognized that this was God's plan. This is a history of God's covenant. You say, well, what was God's covenant? Well, God's covenant to the people in the nation is found in Deuteronomy chapter 28. And that covenant was essentially, as we follow God, we can expect blessings. As we reject the promises of God and God's expectations for us, we can expect cursing. And what we find in these 400 years that comprise the books of 1st and 2nd Kings is we find God honoring that covenant in mercy and honoring that covenant in judgment, and seeing that when God says something, he means it, both for our benefit. Well, I guess it's always for our benefit, but sometimes when it seems good, sometimes when it seems like judgment, God is at work honoring his word to us. Another potential title I thought about for these books was Small K Kings. Small K Kings, because we serve the Lord Jesus Christ, who is the King of Kings and the Lord of Lords. And we can say that he's the big K King because he's the authority that always does right. There's no bad and ugly to Jesus. He's only the good. But when it comes to human leadership, when it comes to human kings, we're going to see there are flaws everywhere. Most of the kings about whom we'll speak in our study were wicked kings. As I said, every single one in the northern kingdom was wicked. And then even in the southern kingdom, many of them were wicked. And even the good ones had some pretty big issues. I think about Asa, I think about Jehoshaphat, I think about Hezekiah and Josiah and others. Even the best of them, we're going to find out were men at best. So I'm really, really looking forward to this study. And I wanted to just give you maybe a 30,000 foot view in this first lesson. So let's do that. I think it's important anytime that you study a book of the Bible to cover some really comprehensive questions like who, what, when, where. Important. We talked about this at the beginning of this calendar year when we talked about just studying the Bible. So when we think about who, we just talked about that. Who is compiling this book? Well, it's somebody, maybe Jeremiah, but somebody after, or rather during, the Babylonian captivity. So while we're covering history that basically goes from 970 BC to about 560 BC, so that what would that be? 410 years. We are having an author that's talking about that history at the end. Otherwise, you wouldn't be able to write the last chapter, right? So we know that this is 400 years of history where an author is taking these events, these histories, these little bio sketches of these kings and these prophets and weaving a larger message. So what is the larger message? The larger message is God keeps his promises. And when we do what God says, there's blessing. And when we violate God's clear word, we bring a curse upon ourselves. So this is the Deuteronomic, let me say that 5 times really fast, the Deuteronomy, blessings and cursings. That's why in the Hebrew Bible, these were one book, 1st and 2nd Kings. It wasn't until the Greek translation of the Hebrew Old Testament, this would have taken place in Alexandria, Egypt in like the 2nd century BC. It wasn't until then that the books were actually divided into 1st and 2nd Kings. So really, this is one big book in the Hebrew Old Testament. And we look at this as an historical book. But in the Hebrew Bible, this was not an historical book. In the Hebrew Bible, this was a part of a section called the former prophets. And this would have covered Joshua, Judges, Ruth, and then 1st and 2nd Chronicles, 1st and 2nd Samuel, 1st and 2nd Kings. These would all be part of what's called the former prophets. So there's a great purpose in the writing of this book, not just in who compiled it, but in who was the intended audience. And remember, the intended audience, the primary audience, the first audience for this book, even though you and I are an audience today, but the first audience was the audience that was in the Babylonian captivity. Now, you can only imagine how important this was for them. Why? Because they had lost their kingdom. The northern kingdom was long since done away with. And then now the southern kingdom has just been besieged and defeated by Nebuchadnezzar. So it would seem, for all intents and purposes, that God's covenant had failed and that the promise he made to David, the Davidic covenant, was no longer in force because, hey, after all, there are no more kings, right? There's no more kingdom. There's no more Israel. So obviously it's all failed, but it hadn't failed. It had just kind of gone below the surface. And that's why 2 Kings ends with God raising up, even in captivity, out of prison, that son who had been taken captive as a young kid, Jeconiah, to be raised up even in Babylon. So even when things are bad, even when things seem lost, what is God doing? God is still honoring the unconditionality of his covenant with Abraham and with David. So the books leave us with great hope that in spite of these small K kings that are a mess, in spite of human history that shows the confusion and the entanglement that sin brings and the consequences, we know that we have a God who has a plan. And in spite of our failures and our foibles, God is always working and bringing his plan into place. And we're going to find that as we study these books. Amazing, amazing story of God's sovereignty as a big K king in spite of the good and the bad and the ugly kings. Now, couple time frames we want to keep in mind. And I mentioned it already, but let me just reiterate. The book of 1 Kings begins really with the death of David and the ascension of Solomon to the throne. We're going to find that in the very first chapter. And so God now is blessing David. Solomon is going to expand the kingdom to its greatest environs. Solomon is going to build the temple. The glory of God is going to come and inhabit that place. It's a really great start. So we go from the glory of the Solomonic temple to the destruction of that temple 400 years later. So what do we see? We see the downward progression, or maybe better said, digression, that happens when failed human leadership is in place. Now we're going to talk about these leaders. And as we talk about these leaders, we're going to find out two main things. Number one, we're going to find out those that did right in the sight of the Lord as a general statement. And we're going to find those that did evil in the sight of the Lord as a general statement. Again, that doesn't mean that a person that did right in the sight of the Lord always did right. It just means that's the general synopsis of his life. And it doesn't mean that those that did evil always did evil. I mean, even wicked Ahab had moments of repentance and humility, but it means that's the general synopsis of his life. So we'll talk about that. Couple dates you want to keep in mind in our study. 722 BC, because that's the end of the northern kingdom. So when we tell the story of the kingdom, small k kingdom, what we're going to see is that the first kingdom, 250 years old. Now that's an ominous number, isn't it? Because if we look at 250 years old from 1 Kings chapter 1 to the end of the northern kingdom, that's the length of that nation. Well, I don't know about you, but that makes me think about the United States of America, because we are celebrating this summer our 250th anniversary. So nations don't have a promise of divine perpetuity, of eternal perpetuity. It's only as nations honor the Lord. Blessed is that nation whose God is the Lord. We'll learn some lessons about that, won't we? And then the second date that's important is 587 BC or 586. The siege was actually 2 years long, where the temple itself was destroyed. And in that sense, so was the southern kingdom. Now, God always honors a remnant, and they came back after 70 years and the temple was rebuilt. And we won't talk about that in this study, but the point is this, that when man is left to himself, when man's leadership is all that you have, you're going to get a continued digression. And so what do we need? We need the promises of God, the mercy of God, the plan of God. And we're going to see all of that. So we're going to stop right there in my introduction. Matter of fact, let me just do this because we've got maybe 2 minutes. I'll just introduce the book to you. So 1 Kings chapter 1, I'm going to read verses 1 through 4, and they're weird verses, so listen to them. Now King David was old and stricken in years, and they covered him with clothes, but he got no heat. I love that. He was old, he was always cold, and so they put coats on him and blankets and did no good. Did you notice I'm wearing my winter coat during the recording of this in the studio? Because that's me. I'm old and I can't get warm anymore. And the Bible says in verse 2, wherefore his servants said unto him, let there be sought for my lord the king a young virgin. Let her stand before the king. Let her cherish him. Let her lie in thy bosom, that my lord the king may get heat. So they sought for a fair damsel throughout all the coasts of Israel, and they found Abishag, a Shunammite, and brought her to the king. Shunem is located actually in the lower Galilee, not far from Nazareth. You can see it from the hill of Nazareth, Shunem. And it says in verse 4, and the damsel was very fair and cherished the king and ministered to him, but the king knew her not. Knew her not in the sense of he did not have a wrong physical relationship with her. Now, it's a weird story. I mean, obviously, and we have to look at the culture of the day, which was if you wanted to get heat, They didn't have indoor heating. They didn't have the kinds of amenities that you and I have today. Can't just turn up the thermostat or, put the gas fireplace on. So body heat was the main go-to. Remember what Solomon said in Ecclesiastes 4, that when two are together, they provide heat, warmth. Even the armies would make soldiers sleep next to each other to get heat. So this wasn't a weird thing. This wasn't a sexual thing. This was David is old. David needs to stay warm because David's about to die. And what that does is that gives us the setting for the entrance of Solomon that begins this whole process of the story of the kings, the good, the bad, and the ugly. So I want you to listen in, be faithful to the podcast over the next couple of months. I think we'll learn some great lessons together. Until then, until next time, have a great day in the Lord, and God bless you, my friends.